Bloomberg has learnt that US tariffs on copper imports could come within weeks.
The United States has just detonated a new trade war. On July 10, 2025, President Donald Trump signed a proclamation imposing a 50% tariff on every pound of imported copper, effective August 1st. The move stunned global markets. Copper futures surged 13% in a single session, hitting a record $5.95 per pound, the steepest one-day gain in the contract's history.
U.S. President Donald Trump says he will now impose a 50% tariff on copper imports.
He says copper imports will soon face a 50% levy, just like steel and aluminum.
And various couple of other things, big ones. We did steel, as you know, they're 50%. We did aluminum, 50%. Lumber just came out.
We're entering that's copper.
And we did cars. And now, today we're doing copper.
But the impact did not stop at Wall Street. It reached much deeper, into the copper veins that stretch from British Columbia to Quebec, through Asia and back into American factories. It cut into the wiring of electric vehicles, the backbone of renewable energy, the guts of commercial aircraft, and the core of residential construction. This is not just another tariff. It is a rupture.
That copper will be added to the list, like steel and aluminum, of materials that are taxed at 50% when they are imported into the United States, and that's a big deal.
A deliberate fracture in the flow of a metal that powers everything. And for Canada, it is a test. Absorb the hit or reroute a $9 billion copper export pipeline before the next strike lands. Before we go further, YouTube is not the biggest fan of content like this, but we believe people deserve to hear the truth. If you agree, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us beat the algorithm and keep going. We really appreciate the support. The copper tariff sends a clear message: negotiate later, pressure first. Trump's administration justified the move under Section 232, citing national security. But the numbers tell a different story. The United States imported more than 800,000 tons of refined copper in 2024. Nearly one quarter came from Canada. That supply now carries a tax burden heavier than luxury goods. Markets reacted instantly. COMEX copper futures spiked past $12,300 per metric ton. The spread between New York and London widened to over $1,600, opening up an arbitrage window traders have never seen before. Warehouses in New Orleans reported a 40% spike in inbound stock. Copper cathodes vanished from the London Metal Exchange. Speculators swarmed, and manufacturers panicked. For automakers, this was a gut punch. Electric vehicles require up to 80 kilograms of copper per unit. A 5-cent increase in copper adds $90 to the base cost of every EV. But since July 8th, copper has climbed nearly $1 per pound. That translates to over $1,400 per vehicle. Ford has already notified suppliers that pass-through charges will hit August invoices. Tesla is expected to follow, and it is not just cars. High-voltage transmission lines, essential to grid upgrades launched under the Biden administration, consume nearly 5 tons of copper per mile. With this tariff, budget forecasts have collapsed. Utilities are scrambling. Project managers are preparing emergency rate hike proposals. The aerospace sector is bracing too. A single commercial aircraft contains over 250 kilometers of copper wiring. For Boeing and Bombardier, the math is brutal. A marginal shift in pricing now translates to multi-million-dollar fluctuations per order. And with defense budgets already strained, supply chain cracks are now appearing on military procurement lines. Even renewable energy is vulnerable. Wind turbines contain more than 4 tons of copper. Solar arrays require copper wiring to remain efficient under variable conditions. As the US races to meet net zero targets, clean infrastructure projects are now facing delays, price reviews, and potential cancellations. The economics of renewables, already under pressure, are narrowing by the day. And for consumers, the pain is direct. Cox Automotive estimates the tariff alone adds $6,000 to the cost of a Canadian-built vehicle. A 50% duty raises that into 5-figure territory. Meanwhile, national home builders report that copper tariffs, combined with lumber shortages, are adding as much as $22,000 to the price of a new home. This is not theory. It is not a projection. It is already happening. Canada is not standing still. Prime Minister Mark Carney has pledged to defend Canadian producers through every legal and diplomatic tool available. But Ottawa is not waiting for the World Trade Organization to process paperwork. The private sector has already moved. Teck Resources, one of Canada's largest miners, has activated its contingency plan. Copper concentrate will now be redirected to smelters in Asia, bypassing US refiners entirely. Future supply will be hedged on the Shanghai Futures Exchange. American orders will be deprioritized. The shift is real and irreversible. In Quebec, provincial officials are holding meetings with buyers in Lima and Santiago. Export fees are being waived, shipping contracts are being renegotiated, the copper trade is being rebuilt in real time. Statistics Canada reports that copper exports to Asia rose by nearly 27% in the second quarter, the largest jump since 2015. Smelters in South Korea and Japan are placing advance orders. Shipping queues at the Port of Vancouver are stretching longer. Container traffic once bound for Seattle is now being rerouted to Prince Rupert. Even before the copper tariff was announced, Canada made a final diplomatic concession. Ottawa scrapped its proposed digital services tax, a goodwill gesture aimed at easing trade tensions. But it was not enough. Just days later, Washington hit back with the copper duty. And now, trade analysts warn that pharmaceutical imports may be next, with a 200% tariff on prescription drugs looming if no agreement is reached by July 22nd.
President Donald Trump floated the idea of imposing a 200% tariff on pharmaceutical imports into the US on Tuesday.
The timing matters because that date, July 22nd, is when Canada's countermeasures are scheduled to begin. 125 billion Canadian dollars in US imports are on standby.
The Prime Minister has a 30-day deadline to broker a deal, but is under pressure to act now.
Bay Street analysts estimate that if retaliatory tariffs land, American exporters could face a 4% contraction in cross-border sales. That figure could rise depending on the sectors targeted. And trade patterns are already shifting. Statistics Canada reported a 25% surge in exports to non-US markets in March. US-bound shipments dropped over 6%. That is the widest quarterly trade gap in nearly a decade. Public sentiment is following. A Montreal street poll recorded by Global News found widespread support for a boycott of US goods.
Patricia, many shoppers I spoke to today say that they are thinking more and more about what they are putting in their cart, putting a renewed focus on Canadian-made goods. But one expert says it can be a bit more complicated than that because of how closely our two countries often work together to get things into your fridge.
Echoing the backlash seen during the 2018 metals dispute, hashtags supporting Canadian sourcing trended across social platforms. Industry is responding. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce has urged the federal government to fast-track its Indo-Pacific diversification strategy, with an emphasis on long-term deals with buyers in Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia. Copper is no longer just a commodity, it is leverage, and Canada is using it. Labour unions are pushing too. Unifor, Canada's largest private sector union, is lobbying Parliament for emergency wage support and targeted relief for copper-producing regions. They warn that a prolonged supply chain disruption could cause permanent job losses in smelting and refining communities from Kitimat to Rouyn-Noranda. Meanwhile, American manufacturers are now caught in the middle. Over 200 petitions for tariff exemptions have been filed with the US Department of Commerce. Industry coalitions are asking for relief for medical devices, EV components, power grid systems, and industrial machinery. But approvals could take months. And by then, the damage will already be baked in. UBS has modeled the worst-case scenario. If the copper premium between New York and global markets holds above $1,000 per metric ton through September, US manufacturers could absorb an additional $4.2 billion in material costs this quarter alone. That impact could shave half a point off US GDP by year-end. The ripple effects stretch from factory floors to federal balance sheets, and yet the tariff remains. This is no longer just about copper. It is about how quickly a single executive order can fracture a continent-wide supply chain. It is about whether North America's economic system can withstand political brinkmanship. It is about whether allies still trust each other to play by the rules, or whether they are preparing for a future where each moves alone. What happens in the next 10 days will shape more than just copper pricing. It will decide whether this remains a trade dispute or becomes a structural realignment. Because the question now is not whether Canada can adapt, it already has. The question is whether the United States can afford the consequences of pushing its closest trade partner into the arms of its competitors. Let us know what you think in the comments. And do not forget to subscribe to Auto News and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest political economic updates.